The PlayStation 2 had 4 megabytes of video memory, no texture compression, a processor running games at 30 frames on a good day. And yet the developers who worked on it kept asking for more. More polygons, more world, more story, more spectacle. Some of them got away with it. Some of them technically didn't. These tested what the hardware could do and occasionally proved its limits in real time. Xenosaga Episode 1 arrived on the PS2 in 2002 and immediately established its priorities. The cinematic sequences, developed by Monolith Soft with a London Philharmonic Orchestra score, were the most technically demanding elements on the disc. Real-time cutscenes ran at character model quality that pushed the PS2's polygon budget to its ceiling, and the game's total FMV and in-engine cutscene runtime ran to approximately 4 hours. A commitment to cinematic presentation that the hardware struggled to sustain without visible load time and frame rate concessions. The battle system layered real-time action point management over field positioning over mech combat, all within the same visual fidelity that the cutscenes established. The game's ETB system ran multiple combatants through simultaneous action cues, and the visual quality maintained during battle required the same polygon counts as cinematic sequences, a decision that cost the engine stability in exchange for visual coherence. Players and emulators alike noted that Xenosaga was both CPU and GPU intensive in ways that made it harder to run smoothly than almost any other PS2 RPG, a consequence of building cutscenes and gameplay to the same visual specification. The limitation isn't the technology, it's the balance between story and gameplay. This was more interested in its narrative than its systems, and players who don't connect with its dense sci-fi philosophy may find the ratio of cutscene to gameplay frustrating. The overall arc was never completed as intended, with episodes 2 and 3 compressing a story planned across 6 entries. But as a single statement of how cinematic a PS2 RPG could aspire to be, Episode 1 pushed harder than almost anything released that year.
I just want to run away from it all.
Grandia 3 arrived in 2006 as GameArt's third mainline entry in their long-running JRPG series, and it arrived with a technical priority so clear it shaped everything else. The battle system's visual presentation was going to be the finest on PS2, regardless of what that cost elsewhere in the game. The result is a combat engine that game-specific retrospectives consistently single out as one of the most technically accomplished on the platform, and a game that sacrificed almost everything outside of combat to achieve it. The Grandia 3 battle system is a refinement of the IP cancel mechanic that the series had built since the first game. A charge-based turn order where interrupting an enemy mid-cast cancels their action entirely and sends them back to the start of their charge, creating a combat rhythm built around anticipation, timing, and animation reads. The visual quality of every ability animation, every spell effect, every cancel interrupt was pushed to the ceiling of what the PS2 could render without dropping below its target frame rate. Side-by-side comparisons with contemporary JRPGs show a visible gap in the quality of the battle environment rendering. Grandia 3 looked like a PS3 game in its combat sequences. Everything outside those battles can be shaky. The story is thin. A boy who wants to fly, a girl who sings, a villain whose motivation is introduced late and resolved quickly. And multiple reviewers noted the disconnect between the quality of the combat and the quality of the narrative surrounding it. Famitsu awarded it 36 out of 40. RPG Gamer's retrospective called the story forgettable while calling the battle system one of the best in the genre. That split verdict is accurate. Grandia 3 is a complete argument for its combat engine delivered inside an incomplete game. Onimusha Dawn of Dreams closed the PS2 chapter of the Onimusha series in 2006, the same year the PS3 launched in Japan, and it did so with a production that felt like a developer spending every remaining credit on a platform before leaving it. Capcom's fourth mainline, this is the longest, most mechanically ambitious entry in the series. 5 playable characters with fully distinct combat systems. a Dark Realm bonus dungeon system that scaled to the player's progression, and a visual presentation that pushed the PS2's character polygon counts and environmental lighting to the limit of what the hardware could sustain. The multi-character system required the PS2 to maintain full AI companion behavior for whichever party member wasn't player-controlled, alongside the active character's combat physics, alongside enemy AI built across 4 games. The Genma absorption mechanic, which powered abilities and unlocked upgrades, ran across all 5 characters simultaneously rather than concentrating progression in a single protagonist, multiplying the data management requirements accordingly. The Dark Realm encounters stripped the player of items and forced reliance on base character performance, generating combat visual density within an isolated system. The honest limitation is pacing. Dawn of Dreams is considerably longer than its predecessors and loses some of the focused tension that the earlier games maintained through brevity. The story, connecting to a new generation of fighters 30 years later, has ambitions the localization and voice direction don't always serve. But as a final statement on what Onimusha could do with PS2 hardware at the end of its life, it committed fully before the industry moved on.
Be with you. It has already been decided.
Devil May Cry 3 is a pure action game, a hack-and-slash spectacle fighter developed by Capcom and released in 2005. What it shares with the other games on this list is the relationship between its ambition and the hardware it ran on. DMC3 pushed the PS2's action capacity further than anything before it, and the performance result was a game that technically delivered its vision while running at the cost of consistent stability. The style system, 5 combat stances switchable in real time, each with its own move set and environmental interactions, require the PS2 to evaluate stance state, enemy response AI, hitbox calculations, and animation blending simultaneously at the pace the combat demanded. Dante's expanded moveset comprised more distinct inputs and transitions than any action game had attempted on the hardware. Late-game boss fights, particularly Virgil encounters, drove visual density to the point where the frame rate visibly suffered, the console running combination sequences against high-polygon enemies at full fidelity. DMC3 arrived after the sequel had been widely criticized as underdeveloped. Director Hideaki Itsuno's response was an overcorrection in the best possible direction, a game harder, faster, and more mechanically demanding than the original and beyond DMC2 in every dimension. The special edition added Virgil as a playable character with a distinct moveset. The combat ceiling for skilled players remains one of the highest in the action genre. This asked more of the hardware than the hardware wanted to give, and gave back something the console library had never seen. Persona 3 arrived in 2006, the same year as the PS3's Japanese launch, and established the visual and structural template that the series would refine for the next decade. Atlas built a high school social simulation on top of a dungeon crawler on top of a calendar-driven resource management game, and the PS2 ran all 3 layers simultaneously within a production that featured full voice acting, animated cutscene sequences, and a visual design that defined the series' aesthetic identity going forward. The Tartarus Dungeon is the hardware cost made visible, a procedurally generated tower of 250-plus floors, climbing through the night while the clock advanced toward the full moon boss battles, required the PS2 to sustain a generation system across its longest single structure. The social link system, 10 to 11 ranks, each across 22 possible confidants, tracked across the 365-day calendar, ran alongside dungeon progression, alongside school, sim alongside shadow combat, demanding simultaneous state management from the engine that the hardware handled without visible failure, but clearly at the limit of its comfort. Tartarus itself is the biggest point of contention. The floors are procedurally generated to a degree that makes extended sessions feel repetitive. The dungeon's visual theming changes by block, but the individual floor layouts are sameness by design. The original release's party AI, companions controlled by the game rather than the player, frustrated many players before the expansion introduced direct party control. But Persona 3 remains the game that proved the series could be both systems dense and emotionally resonant simultaneously, and nothing else on PS2 demonstrated that combination as completely.
However,
Dragon Quest VIII is how you find out what a developer can do when the constraints are generous. Level 5 brought Akira Toriyama's character designs into full 3D cell shading on PS2 hardware, and the result, announced with a 2004 Japanese release that generated something close to hardware benchmark conversation among the development community, was the most visually lavish RPG the system ever ran. The draw distance alone was remarkable. Fields that extended to visible horizons, populated with enemies moving naturally across them, rendered with a color density that most PS2 games avoided because the hardware cost was too high. The technical approach to the cell shading separated DQ8 from every other PS2 RPG visually, where most cell-shaded games used flat color fills and outlines. Level 5 implemented volumetric lighting and subsurface scattering within the cell shade pass, giving characters a visual weight and dimensionality that made them feel like they belonged to a world rather than sat atop one. The party of 4 characters maintained full visual fidelity in battle sequences alongside enemy models that matched cutscene quality, all at the stable 30 FPS the engine demanded. But in the alchemy system, crafting requires combining ingredients without recipes, leaving the player to discover combinations through guesswork or external guides. Some find this a satisfying layer of discovery. Others find it an unclear wall between them and half the game's best equipment. The story is warm and classical rather than ambitious, which suits the Dragon Quest tradition, but may underwhelm players expecting narrative complexity. None of this diminishes what Level 5 built. Dragon Quest VIII remains the most beautiful game the PS2 ever ran at consistent performance. Final Fantasy XII arrived in 2006 as the last major Final Fantasy built exclusively for the PS2, and it spent that distinction making every technical claim it could. The GDC post-mortem from programming supervisor Taku Murata outlined the specific constraints. The PS2's severe memory restrictions required custom in-house tools just to preview assets on the hardware they'd actually run on. Character models pushed near the polygon limit while the game simultaneously populated areas with over 1,000 unique NPCs. Final Fantasy X, by comparison, had just over 200. That volume of ambition pushed the release nearly 2 years past its original date. The active dimension battle system, removing random encounters and resolving combat in the same environment where enemies were visible, placed unprecedented simultaneous demands on hardware. The Gambit system, which let you program AI behaviors for your entire party, had a run party logic alongside environmental population alongside combat resolution, all within 4 megabytes of video RAM. The texture work under those constraints is remarkable. Developers hand-painted every texture at the pixel level, a technique born of necessity that produced art direction distinctive enough that the 2017 remaster's upscale textures were criticized for losing the coherence of the original's restrained palette. Edge named it Game of the Year in 2006, and Famitsu also agreed. There are, however, criticisms that the story, though ambitious in concept, never fully delivers on the weight its setup implies. Yasumi Matsuno's departure mid-development left a visible seam in the narrative. But as a technical achievement built under constraints that would have broken most teams, Final Fantasy XII is extraordinary.
Kairi, I know you.
Kingdom Hearts 2 arrived in 2005 in Japan and 2006 in the West, and the most immediate thing it communicated was that it was doing more than its predecessor could. The first Kingdom Hearts ran at a locked 30 frames per second. The sequel ran at 60. An enormous commitment on PS2 hardware that required the development team at Square to optimize every system from the ground up to maintain it. The battle system's speed and visual density only makes sense at 60 frames, and the decision to build for that target locked in an ambition the rest of the game had to match. The Disney World environments in the sequel are significantly more complex than those in the first, with Hollow Bastion's battle sequences, particularly the Heartless Invasion with 1,000 enemies on screen simultaneously, representing a feat of draw call management that pushed the PS2's emotion engine past what should have been feasible. Reaction commands, introduced in the sequel, layered contextual animation triggers over the real-time combat, requiring the engine to evaluate environmental conditions, enemy states, and player input simultaneously without breaking the 60-frame target. In the most intense sequences, it struggled. For most of the runtime it held. Most criticism are structural. The opening hours, the Roxa sequence, are notoriously slow to arrive at anything the player can engage with, and some reviewers found the story's complexity more overwhelming than rewarding. The Disney worlds vary significantly in quality, with some feeling like obligations rather than designs. But as a mechanical object, a PS2 action RPG running at 60 frames through dense environments, Kingdom Hearts 2 remains an achievement the platform rarely matched. Shadow of the Colossus is the most technically honest game on this list. It never tried to hide what it cost the hardware to run. Team Ico's 2005 PS2 release built real-time inverse kinematics that recalculated Wander's bone structure to match terrain on the fly, so his feet adjusted correctly to slopes. It implemented motion blur calculated from camera velocity between frames. The bosses averaged 20,000 polygons each, enormous for the era, and the game rendered an open world around them at 512 by 448 pixels just to conserve the video memory it needed for everything else. The price was frame rate. The game targeted 60 frames per second with VSync enabled, which in practice meant the console stepped down to 30, then 20, then 15, then lower during Colossus fights. The game ran at 15 to 20 frames per second in the PS2's most demanding sequences, a number that modern players returning to the original find genuinely difficult after the Blue Point remasters. That performance deficit was not a failure of ambition. It was the console hitting its ceiling. The PS2 could not run what they asked of it and stabilize the output simultaneously, and the team shipped anyway. What they shipped is one of the most visually impressive games ever made. The HDR bloom, the motion blur, the grass physics on the plains, the weight of each Colossus, all of it pushed the hardware past sustainable operation. The Digital Foundry analysis of the PS2 version reads like a case study in managed impossibility. Every Colossus fight was a question of whether the PS2 could hold together long enough to let you finish it.
I'll bet.
Nocturne is a PS2 game built around the world after everyone in it dies. Released in Japan in 2003 and internationally in 2004, Atlus's turn on the mainline SMT series produced a post-apocalyptic Tokyo rendered with a spare visual language that pressed the hardware in a different direction from its contemporaries. Not toward volume or spectacle, but toward atmosphere. The city in ruin, the labyrinthine dungeons, and the shifting vortex world that replaced the Earth after the conception are rendered at a visual density that used the PS2's constraints deliberately rather than fighting against them. The Matador boss, approximately 2 hours in, before most players feel adequately prepared, is the point at which SMT Nocturne announces what it is. The press-turn battle system, where every action either extended or consumed your turn count based on whether it hit a weakness, converges on encounters designed to end unprepared parties efficiently. Demon negotiation requires reading each demon's personality and responding appropriately. Fusing higher-tier demons from lower components using over 150 recruitable demons is a separate mechanical challenge that runs the entire game. But Nocturne offers almost no guidance and a difficulty calibration built around the assumption that the player will learn by dying. Some players hit Matador and do not return. The story's philosophical framework rewards engagement, but never explains itself. For the players it's made for, Nocturne is the most complete expression of the mainline SMT series. For everyone else, it's the reason the series has a reputation problem.
And the new world
will arise.